I'm 68 years old, and I haven't touched a motorcycle in 37 years. Not since that September night in 1987 when I learned that some things in this world are faster than a Harley-Davidson running full throttle through the back roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Not since I met Solomon, though I wouldn't learn his name until months later, when fear had transformed into the deepest friendship of my life. My name is Jake Morrison, and before that night changed everything, I was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to find tearing through mountain curves on two wheels at midnight. 28 years old, fresh out of a messy divorce, riding a 1985 Softail that I'd rebuilt from scrap metal and stubbornness. I worked construction during the day and rode the mountain roads by night, chasing something I couldn't name through forests so dark and deep they felt like tunnels leading to the center of the earth. I thought I knew every inch of those mountains, every curve, every straightaway, every overlook where you could pull off and watch the valley lights twinkle like fallen stars. I'd been riding those roads since I was 16, first on a beat-up Honda, then on increasingly powerful machines that fed my need for speed and the illusion of control it gave me. The mountains were my sanctuary, my therapy, my escape from a world that seemed determined to grind me down with its endless demands and disappointments. What I didn't know was that something else had been using those same roads for far longer than I had. Something that moved through the darkness with the silence of flowing water and the intelligence of a being that had learned to avoid human contact at all costs. Something that had been watching me ride past his territory for months, studying my patterns, my routes, my habits with the patience of a creature that measured time in seasons rather than minutes. The night it all began, I was running from more than just boredom. I'd gotten word that afternoon that my ex-wife was remarrying. Some accountant with a steady job and a sensible sedan who probably never understood the need to feel 1,000 pounds of steel and chrome responding to your every thought. The news hit me harder than I'd expected, stirring up feelings I thought I'd buried beneath layers of leather and engine oil. So I did what I always did when the world got too complicated. I fired up the Harley and headed for the mountains. It was just past midnight when I first saw the eyes reflecting in my headlight. 2 points of amber light positioned about 8 feet off the ground, too high to be a deer, too widely spaced to be anything that belonged in these mountains. They appeared around a sharp curve on Route 221, just past the old logging road that led up toward Grandfather Mountain, and for a split second I thought they might be reflectors on a road sign I'd somehow never noticed before. Then they blinked and moved, and I realized with a shock that turned my blood to ice water that something impossibly large was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path, showing no intention of moving aside for a motorcycle traveling 60 miles per hour through the darkness. I yanked the handlebars hard to the right, hard too, feeling the rear wheel lose traction on loose gravel as I fought to avoid whatever was blocking my way. The Harley went into a sideways slide that should have killed me, sparks flying from the foot pegs as they scraped across asphalt, the engine howling in protest as I tried to regain control. Somehow, through luck or divine intervention or the stubborn engineering of Milwaukee steel, I managed to keep the bike upright and bring it to a shuddering stop about 50 yards past the curve. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely thumb the kill switch. In the sudden silence that followed the engine's death, I could hear my heart pounding like a jackhammer against my ribs, could taste copper and adrenaline on my tongue. I turned around slowly, expecting to see a fallen tree or maybe a confused black bear wandering across the road. What I saw instead was a figure standing in the pale circle of my headlight, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It stood upright like a man, but with proportions that belonged in nightmares. Shoulders broad enough to span a doorway, arms that hung nearly to its knees, a massive head that turned toward me with deliberate, calculating intelligence. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours, we stared at each other across that stretch of empty road. I could see its chest rising and falling with breath, could make out details that my brain refused to process. The almost human shape of its face, the careful way it held its massive hands, The expression in those amber eyes that wasn't animal cunning but something far more complex and infinitely more unsettling. Then it did something that changed everything I thought I knew about monsters and myths and the things that supposedly didn't exist in the modern world. It raised one enormous hand and gestured toward the forest, a clear invitation for me to follow. When I didn't move, couldn't move, frozen somewhere between terror and fascination, it gestured again, more insistently this time, and took a step toward me. That's when my survival instincts finally overrode my paralysis. I hit the starter, and the Harley roared back to life with a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains. I popped the clutch and gunned it, spinning the rear wheel as I accelerated away from that impossible encounter, riding harder and faster than I'd ever ridden before, convinced that I was racing for my life against something that shouldn't exist. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until months later, was that I wasn't running from a monster that night. I was running from someone who would become the truest friend I'd ever known. The pursuit began 3 miles down the mountain, just past the bridge over Davidson Creek where the road curved sharply through a grove of ancient oaks. I'd been pushing the Harley harder than I'd ever pushed any machine, taking curves at speeds that would have terrified me in daylight, when I caught a glimpse in my mirrors that made my blood turn to slush. Something was following me through the forest, moving parallel to the road with a speed and silence that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It wasn't running. Running implies a certain desperation, a loss of control. This was something else entirely. The creature moved through the trees with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill, covering ground that should have taken hours in a matter of minutes, never seeming to strain or struggle against the terrain that would have stopped a human dead in their tracks. Massive pine trees that had stood for centuries bent aside like grass as it passed, and I could hear the sound of its passage, a rhythmic whoosh whoosh that seemed to match the beating of my own terrified heart. Every time I thought I'd lost it, every time I convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks born from adrenaline and darkness, I'd catch another glimpse in the periphery of my headlight's reach. A shadow moving between the trees, a flash of dark fur, those amber eyes reflecting back at me from impossible angles and distances. It was staying with me effortlessly, matching my speed without seeming to exert any effort, and gradually I began to understand that I wasn't escaping. I was being herded. The Harley was giving everything it had. The engine screamed at redline as I downshifted for the curves and opened it up on the straightaways, the speedometer needle dancing between 70 and 80 on roads that weren't designed for anything faster than 35. My knees dragged against the asphalt as I leaned into turns that should have high-sided me into the guardrails, and I could smell the acrid stench of overheated brake pads every time I had to scrub speed for the tighter corners. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how desperately I pushed that machine beyond its limits, the thing in the forest stayed with me. More than that, I began to realize it was guiding me, cutting off certain routes by appearing briefly on my left when I might have turned onto side roads, forcing me to stay on the main highway that led deeper into the mountains, away from town and civilization, and any hope of help. The realization that I was being deliberately guided, rather than randomly chased, should have terrified me more, but somehow it had the opposite effect. If this creature wanted me dead, it could have simply stepped into the road again and let physics handle the rest. My bike weighed maybe 700 pounds wet. That thing had to weigh at least 5 times that much. A collision would have been instantly fatal, and there would have been no way to explain the wreckage to anyone who found it. Instead, it seemed to want something else, though what a 9-foot-tall forest creature could want from a scared biker was beyond my ability to imagine. All I could do was keep riding, keep following the path it was setting for me, and hope that whatever was happening would eventually make some kind of sense. The chase, if you could call it that, lasted almost 20 minutes before I began to understand where it was leading me. We were heading toward the old Pisgah Forest logging camp, a place that had been abandoned since the 1960s when environmental regulations made large-scale timber operations impractical in the national forest. I'd explored the ruins a few times over the years, finding something fascinating about the way nature had begun to reclaim the buildings and equipment that men had left behind. As I crested the hill that overlooked the camp, I could see the skeletal remains of the main lodge and several outbuildings silhouetted against the starlit sky. The access road was barely more than 2 tire ruts carved through undergrowth that had grown thick and wild in the decades since the last logging truck had made this journey. I had no choice but to slow down as my headlight picked out fallen logs and washouts that could have destroyed the bike if I hit them at speed. That's when the creature finally revealed itself fully. As I navigated carefully down the access road, it stepped out of the tree line about 50 yards ahead of me, no longer trying to hide or maintain the pretense that this was a chase. In the full beam of my headlight, I got my first clear look at what had been pursuing me through the mountains, and the sight drove every coherent thought from my mind. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, with a build that combined human intelligence with something far more primal and powerful. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur that looked almost black in my headlight but showed hints of deep brown at the edges. Its face was simultaneously familiar and alien, clearly intelligent, with eyes that held depths of thought and emotion, but structured in ways that reminded me more of our distant evolutionary ancestors than anything walking the earth today. What struck me most wasn't its size or its obvious strength, though both were intimidating beyond description. It was the way it carried itself, with dignity, purpose, and what I can only describe as sadness. This wasn't a monster that had dragged me into the mountains to feast on my bones. This was someone who had something to show me, something important enough to risk exposure to the one species it had spent its life avoiding. It gestured toward the ruins of the logging camp with one massive hand, then looked directly at me with an expression that somehow conveyed both invitation and warning. "Come, but understand that once you do, everything changes." I sat there on my idling Harley, engine ticking as it cooled, faced with a choice that would define the rest of my life. Flee back toward the safety of civilization and never know what this creature wanted, or follow it into those ruins and discover truths that would transform everything I thought I knew about the world. I chose to follow, though choice might be too generous a word for what felt more like destiny pulling me forward on invisible strings. I killed the engine and dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate and non-threatening, the way you'd approach a wild animal that could crush you without effort but had chosen not to. The silence that followed the Harley's death was profound, the kind of mountain quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the small sounds of life continuing in the darkness around you. The creature, I couldn't think of him as it anymore, not after seeing the intelligence in those amber eyes, waited patiently as I walked my bike to a stand of pine trees and kicked down the side stand. He watched my every movement with the focused attention of someone taking careful measure of a potential threat or ally, and I found myself moving with exaggerated care, desperate not to trigger whatever instincts might turn this strange encounter violent. When I straightened up and faced him fully, he gestured again toward the ruins, then began walking in that direction with steps that seemed too graceful for something his size. I followed, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and dry pine needles, feeling utterly insignificant next to his massive frame. Up close, I could see details that my terrified brain had missed during the chase. The way his fur seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, the careful deliberation of his movements, the obvious intelligence behind his choice to bring me to this specific place. The main lodge had been built from local stone and massive timber beams, constructed to last for generations by men who understood that the mountains demanded buildings as permanent and solid as the land itself. Time and weather had taken their toll. The roof had partially collapsed, vines had claimed most of the walls, and animals had made homes in what had once been human spaces. But the basic structure remained sound, a testament to the skill of long-dead craftsmen. He led me around to the back of the building, where a loading dock faced what had once been the main yard for timber operations. Massive stumps dotted the clearing like ancient monuments, some of them so large that 3 men holding hands couldn't have reached around their circumference. Nature was slowly reclaiming even these remnants. Moss covered their surfaces and saplings grew from their rotting centers, the forest's patient work of healing visible everywhere I looked. Near the largest of these stumps, the creature stopped and turned to face me. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, two beings from different worlds trying to bridge a gap that seemed unbridgeable. Then he did something that changed everything. He sat down, carefully lowering his massive frame to the ground in a gesture that was unmistakably peaceful, non-threatening, an invitation for conversation between equals. I sat too, cross-legged on the pine needles, feeling foolish and scared and strangely honored all at the same time. We were maybe 10 feet apart, close enough that I could see the texture of his fur, the way his chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed almost human in its rhythm. Close enough to smell him too. Not the rank animal odor I'd expected, but something cleaner, more complex, like cedar and rain and something else I couldn't identify. He began to communicate, not with words, but with gestures and expressions that gradually became comprehensible. He pointed to himself, then to the ruins around us, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire valley. This had been his home long before the loggers came, and it remained his home long after they'd left. He'd watched the men cut down trees that had been growing since before his grandfather's grandfather was born, had witnessed the rape of land that his people had protected for countless generations. The story he told me, through patience and repetition and a growing vocabulary of shared understanding, was one of loss and displacement, and the kind of grief that comes from watching everything familiar disappear. His people had once lived openly in these mountains, not as the hidden, mythical creatures they'd been forced to become, but as the original inhabitants of a land that white men would later claim and divide and destroy in their hunger for resources and profit. As the night wore on, I began to understand that I hadn't been randomly chosen for this encounter. He'd been watching me for months, studying my habits as I rode through his territory night after night. He'd seen something in my solitary wandering, my obvious disconnection from the human world, that reminded him of his own isolation. We were both outcasts in our own ways, me by choice, him by necessity. He showed me things that night that challenged everything I thought I knew about intelligence and consciousness. Using charcoal from an old campfire, he drew detailed maps on the flat surface of a fallen log, showing me territories and boundaries and sacred places that existed in a geography invisible to human eyes. He demonstrated his understanding of human technology by perfectly mimicking the sound of my motorcycle engine, complete with the slight miss in the timing that I'd been meaning to fix for months. Most remarkably, he showed me his capacity for emotion. When our makeshift conversation turned to the changes he'd witnessed in the mountains over his lifetime, the pollution in the streams, the reduction of wildlife, the encroachment of human development, his expression became unmistakably sorrowful. At one point, he covered his face with his hands in a gesture so human, so filled with recognizable pain, that I felt tears start in my own eyes. By dawn, we'd established something that went beyond communication. We'd found understanding. He walked me back to my motorcycle as the first light filtered through the pine canopy, and I knew without being told that this wasn't goodbye. This was the beginning of something unprecedented in both our lives, a friendship that would bridge the gap between species, between worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. As I fired up the Harley and prepared to ride back to my human life, he placed one enormous hand on the bike's gas tank. The gesture was unmistakably possessive, protective. "You belong here now," he seemed to be saying. "This is your territory too." Over the following months, I lived two completely separate lives. My human existence during the day and my secret friendship with Solomon during the long mountain nights. Yes, Solomon. That's what I eventually learned to call him, through the same patient process of gesture and repetition that had taught us to communicate about so many other things. It wasn't his real name, of course. His people had sounds for each other that my throat couldn't reproduce and my ears could barely distinguish. But Solomon was what he seemed to understand when I needed a name for him. And somehow it fit his grave dignity and ancient wisdom. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, I would ride up to the old logging camp under cover of darkness. Solomon was always waiting, as if he could sense my approach from miles away. We developed rituals, patterns of interaction that became as important to me as anything in my daylight world. I'd bring food, not because he needed it, but because sharing meals seemed to be a universal language of friendship. Apples, bread, sometimes fish I'd caught in the mountain streams. He would reciprocate with gifts from his world, perfectly shaped stones, rare herbs that grew only in the highest elevations. Once a piece of crystal quartz so clear and pure it seemed to contain trapped starlight. Our communication evolved into something approaching language. Solomon learned to recognize dozens of English words, and I learned to read the subtle changes in his posture and expression that conveyed complex thoughts and emotions. He taught me signs his people used, hand gestures that meant danger, safe, follow, stay. I taught him about human tools and technology, showing him how my motorcycle worked, letting him examine my flashlight and pocket knife with the intense curiosity of an engineer studying alien artifacts. But the most profound conversations happened when we simply sat together in the ruins, sharing the silence of the mountains while 2 very different kinds of intelligence found ways to connect across the vast gulf of biology and culture. Solomon would tell me about his childhood. Yes, childhood, because despite his imposing size and obvious age, he'd once been young and playful and innocent, learning the ways of his people from elders who'd protected these mountains for centuries. Through patient storytelling that combined gestures, expressions, and the kind of drawings he could make in dirt or charcoal, I learned about his family. He'd had a mate once. He showed me by touching his chest over his heart, then making a gesture that encompassed absence, loss, gone forever. Hunters had killed her 30 years earlier, and the grief in his eyes when he shared this memory was so raw and immediate that I understood his pain had never diminished, never become manageable, only learned to be carried with dignity. He'd had children, too. 2 young ones who would have been learning to hunt and forage and understand their place in the complex ecology of the mountains. The hunters had taken them as well, not from malice but from fear and misunderstanding. Humans reacting to the unknown with violence because it seemed safer than trying to comprehend something that challenged their view of the world. The weight of Solomon's losses helped me understand why my friendship meant so much to him. For 3 decades, he'd been completely alone, the last of his people in these mountains, carrying knowledge and memories that would die with him unless he found someone to share them with. Our midnight meetings weren't just companionship. They were his only chance to pass on something of what his people had known, to ensure that some small part of their wisdom survived into whatever future awaited the mountains they'd protected for so long. My human life began to suffer from the weight of the secret I carried. I'd always been something of a loner, but now I became almost hermetic, avoiding social situations where I might accidentally reveal something about my midnight adventures. How could I explain to drinking buddies that I spent my free time learning forest lore from a 9-foot-tall cryptid? How could I tell anyone about the profound conversations I had with someone whose very existence challenged everything science claimed to know about evolution and biology? Work became mechanical, something I did to earn money for gas and food and the minimal maintenance required to keep me functional. Construction projects that once engaged my problem-solving skills now felt trivial, meaningless busy work that filled the hours until I could return to the mountains. My supervisor noticed my distraction, my increasing tendency to work alone rather than on crews, my reluctance to participate in the casual socializing that made long days bearable. Relationships became impossible. I tried dating a few times, attempting to maintain some connection to normal human interaction. But how do you explain to a woman why you disappear 3 nights a week? How do you justify the scratches and bruises from hiking through mountain terrain in the dark? How do you share any meaningful part of your life when the most important relationship you have is unspeakable? The isolation might have been bearable if Solomon's situation hadn't been deteriorating as rapidly as my own. Each time I saw him, he seemed older, more tired, carrying a weight that went beyond physical exhaustion. He was the keeper of knowledge that had no one to inherit it, the guardian of territories that were shrinking every year as human development crept higher into the mountains. He watched helplessly as the streams he'd known since childhood became polluted with runoff from construction projects, as the animal populations he'd helped maintain for decades declined under pressure from habitat loss and climate change. Worst of all, he lived in constant fear of discovery by the kind of humans who would see him as a trophy rather than a person. He'd shown me evidence of their presence: game cameras mounted in trees near his traditional paths, unusual tire tracks in remote areas, the kind of organized searching that suggested someone knew these mountains harbored something worth finding. The knowledge that our friendship was putting him in danger began to eat away at my conscience, but I couldn't bring myself to break the connection that had become the most meaningful part of both our lives. We were caught in a trap neither of us had chosen, bound together by loneliness and understanding, even as that very bond threatened the safety we'd found in each other's company. The end came in October of 1987, 3 days after the first hard frost painted the mountain ridges silver and announced winter's approach to the Blue Ridge. I'd been riding up to the logging camp as usual, taking the familiar curves at speeds that had become second nature when I noticed tire tracks that didn't belong, fresh ruts from heavy vehicles that had no legitimate business in that remote area. My blood turned cold as I recognized the pattern. Organized searchers, probably equipped with night vision and tranquilizer guns, the kind of people who saw creatures like Solomon as specimens to be captured rather than beings to be respected. Solomon wasn't at our usual meeting place. For the first time in 8 months of regular visits, I waited by the main lodge without seeing those amber eyes watching from the tree line. I called his name softly, using the sound combination that had become our private signal, but heard nothing except the whisper of wind through dying leaves and the distant cry of an owl announcing its nocturnal hunt. I found him an hour later, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth deeper into the forest than we'd ever traveled together. He was sitting beside a small creek that tumbled over moss-covered stones, his massive frame hunched in a posture that radiated defeat and exhaustion. Even in the darkness, I could see the dart wounds on his shoulder and arm, bright spots of blood where someone had shot him with tranquilizers powerful enough to drop a grizzly bear. But Solomon was stronger than they'd calculated, more resilient than human science could measure. He'd fought through the drugs long enough to escape whatever trap they'd set for him, had made it back to familiar territory through sheer force of will and the kind of determination that comes from a lifetime of avoiding capture. Now he sat by the water, not quite conscious but not unconscious either, existing in that gray space between awareness and oblivion. I stayed with him through the night, keeping watch while the tranquilizers worked their way out of his system, using my jacket to cover the dart wounds and my presence to guard against any pursuit that might follow his trail. By dawn, he was lucid again, but changed in ways that went deeper than physical injury. The spark of hope that had sustained him through our months of friendship had been extinguished, replaced by the weary acceptance of someone who understood that his time was running out. Through gestures and expressions that had become our shared language, he explained what had happened. The hunters had found him 2 nights earlier, using motion sensors and thermal imaging to track his movements through territory he'd considered safe. They'd set up an ambush near one of his traditional food sources, waiting with military precision for him to follow patterns he'd maintained for decades. The trap had been sophisticated, professional, the kind of operation that spoke of government funding and scientific oversight rather than amateur cryptid hunters looking for fame. They'd wanted him alive, healthy, suitable for long-term study in facilities designed to house things that weren't supposed to exist. Solomon had seen enough of human history to understand what captivity would mean: a life spent in concrete cells, subjected to tests and experiments, displayed for the curiosity of people who would never see him as anything more than an interesting anomaly. But what broke my heart wasn't the anger in his eyes as he described the hunt, or even the fear that colored his account of the trap. It was the resignation I saw there, the quiet acceptance that our friendship, however meaningful it had been, was now a luxury neither of us could afford. As long as I continued visiting the mountains, I was providing a connection that could be traced, a pattern that could be studied and exploited by people who would use our bond to predict his movements and set more effective traps. Solomon made the decision for both of us. As the sun climbed above the mountain ridges, painting the October sky in shades of gold and crimson, he stood and gestured toward a distant peak that rose above the tree line like a stone monument to eternity. That was where he was going, into country so remote and dangerous that even the most determined hunters would think twice about following. He would disappear into the high wilderness where his ancestors had hidden during the worst periods of human expansion, becoming once again the myth and legend his people had always been to survive. Before he left, he gave me one final gift. From somewhere in his thick fur, he produced a carving unlike anything I'd ever seen. A piece of antler bone worked into the shape of a motorcycle, complete with tiny details that showed he'd been watching and remembering every aspect of our mechanical friendship. It was his way of saying goodbye and thank you, and I'll remember you all at once, condensed into a piece of art that no museum would ever believe was genuine. I never saw Solomon again, though sometimes on clear nights when the mountain air carries sound for incredible distances, I think I hear something that might be his voice calling across the ridges. The hunting party searched for months afterward, following leads and rumors and reported sightings that led them everywhere except where he'd actually gone. Eventually, they gave up and moved on to other mysteries, leaving the mountains to return to their ancient rhythms. I stopped riding that winter. The Harley sits in my garage now, covered by a tarp and slowly gathering dust, because some chapters of life are too sacred to continue past their natural ending. I moved away from the mountains in 1988, carrying Solomon's carving and memories of friendship that transcended every barrier science claims exists between species. But I know the truth that those hunters never understood, that the scientists with their traps and tranquilizers never grasped. Intelligence isn't limited to creatures that build cities and write books and think they own the world. Sometimes the wisest beings are the ones who choose to remain hidden, who understand that survival means staying invisible to those who would cage what they cannot comprehend. Solomon is still out there somewhere, in places so wild and remote that human footprints have never marked their trails. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I believe he remembers a lonely biker who learned that the greatest friendships are the ones we can never speak about, the bonds that define us precisely because they exist beyond the boundaries of any world we thought we knew.